The year 1704 dawned with a palpable sense of dread across the Holy Roman Empire. The ambitions of France's son, King Louis XIV, threatened to overwhelm the continent entirely. His powerful armies, allied with the forces of Bavaria, were poised to strike a fatal blow against the Grand Alliance. They had fixed their sights on Vienna, the very heart of the Habsburg domains. A successful strike here would surely shatter the coalition arrayed against French dominance. The Dutch Republic remained hesitant, their leaders fearful of leaving their own borders undefended. In England, Queen Anne's government understood the gravity of the situation with stark clarity. The responsibility for a bold counterstroke fell upon the shoulders of one man, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. He was a military commander of unparalleled genius and a diplomat of subtle skill. Marlborough conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. He would march his army from the Spanish Netherlands deep into Germany, a journey of over 250 miles. This grand maneuver was designed to intercept the Franco-Bavarian forces before they could reach Vienna. To achieve this, he had to deceive both his allies and his enemies. The Dutch would never have consented to leaving their frontier so exposed. Marlborough therefore pretended he was merely moving to campaign on the Moselle River. The Great March began in May, a logistical masterpiece in an age of rudimentary transport. Day after day, the columns of red-coated British soldiers and their blue-coated Dutch and German allies pressed onward. Discipline was strictly maintained to ensure speed and goodwill from the local populace. As they moved south, the French commanders grew increasingly confused about Marlborough's true intentions. Eventually, the truth of his daring thrust towards the Danube became terrifyingly clear. In June, Marlborough joined forces with the Imperial Army under the command of Prince Eugene of Savoy. Eugene was a commander of equal stature, a brilliant and aggressive strategist. The two men formed an immediate bond, a partnership that would become legendary in military history. The combined Allied army now sought to bring the Franco-Bavarian force to battle. The enemy was commanded by Marshal Tallard and Marshal Marsin, along with the Elector of Bavaria. They had established a strong defensive position on the north bank of the Danube. Their line was anchored by several fortified villages, turning them into formidable strongpoints. On the French right flank, the village of Blenheim stood near the river's edge. In the center, the village of Oberglau was another bastion of defense. On their left, the village of Lutzingen was held by the Elector's Bavarian troops. A small, marshy stream called the Nebel flowed in front of their entire position. Tallard, confident in his position, believed the Allies would never dare to attack across such difficult ground. He had packed his best infantry regiments into the village of Blenheim. This decision would prove to be a catastrophic error. The morning of August 13th, 1704, was shrouded in a thick mist. Under the cover of this fog, the Allied army began to advance towards the Nebel. Marlborough and Eugene had agreed on a complex but brilliant plan. Eugene would take his forces to the right and engage the Elector and Marsin at Lutzingen. His task was to pin down the Franco-Bavarian left wing, preventing them from reinforcing the center. Meanwhile, Marlborough's main force would assault the French right and center. The battle began around midday as the fog finally burned away. The first shots were fired as Allied artillery opened up on the French positions. On the Allied left, Lord Cutts' division was ordered to attack the village of Blenheim. The British redcoats advanced with parade ground precision, their bayonets fixed. The French defenders, secure behind their stone walls and barricades, held their fire. When the attackers were at point-blank range, a devastating volley erupted from the village. The leading ranks of the British infantry were torn apart. Despite horrific casualties, the survivors pressed on with incredible bravery. They reached the barricades, and savage hand-to-hand fighting ensued. The attack was ultimately repulsed, the British falling back in disarray. Wave after wave of Allied troops were sent against Blenheim, each one broken in turn. The fighting there became a bloody stalemate, consuming more and more French reserves. Simultaneously, on the Allied right, Prince Eugene's attack was also in trouble. His Prussian and Danish troops fought desperately to capture Lutzingen. The Bavarian defenders fought with grim determination for their homeland. Eugene himself rode into the fray, personally rallying his wavering soldiers. Twice his men were driven back, but they refused to break completely. The crucial pinning mission was succeeding, but at a terrible cost. While the flanks were ablaze, Marlborough was preparing his masterstroke in the center. He had noticed that Tallard had weakened his center to reinforce Blenheim. Only squadrons of French cavalry held the line between Blenheim and Oberglau. Passionately, Marlborough began to move his main body of infantry and cavalry across the Nebel stream. The marshy ground made the crossing slow and difficult. The French cavalry launched several charges to disrupt the crossing, but were driven back by disciplined Allied infantry fire. By late afternoon, a massive force of Allied cavalry, nearly 80 squadrons, was formed up on the French side of the stream. They were supported by blocks of infantry and mobile artillery batteries. Marshal Tallard finally realized the mortal danger he was in. He desperately tried to recall infantry from Blenheim, but it was too late. The troops in the village were pinned down and could not be extracted. Around 5 o'clock, Marlborough gave the signal for the final attack. The great tide of Allied cavalry began to move forward, first at a walk, then a trot. The trumpets sounded the charge, and they surged towards the French line. The elite French gendarmerie counter-charged with great courage. For a moment, the Allied advance wavered under the impact. But the weight of numbers and superior coordination of the Allies began to tell. Marlborough's cavalry broke through the French first line, then the second. The French cavalry dissolved into a fleeing mob. Panic spread through the entire French right wing. Thousands of routing soldiers were cut down by the pursuing Allied horsemen. Many more were driven towards the Danube River. In their desperation, hundreds of French soldiers tried to swim across. The vast majority were swept away and drowned in the cold water. Marshal Tallard, nearly blind without his spectacles, was caught up in the rout. He was captured and presented to the Duke of Marlborough. With their center shattered and their commander taken, the French right wing ceased to exist. Attention now turned to the 27 battalions of elite French infantry still trapped in Blenheim. They were now completely isolated, a pocket of resistance in a sea of victorious enemies. Their commander, the Marquis de Clermont, had deserted his post and drowned in the Danube. Leaderless and without hope of relief, the defenders' morale began to crumble. Some attempted a desperate breakout, but were easily driven back. Marlborough brought up his artillery and began to systematically bombard the village. Faced with annihilation, the French command had no choice but to negotiate. The entire garrison of Blenheim, over 10,000 men, laid down their arms as prisoners. It was a humiliation on a scale the French army had never before experienced. On the French left, Marsin and the Elector of Bavaria saw the disaster that had unfolded. They skillfully extricated their forces and began a long, sorrowful retreat. Prince Eugene's battered troops were too exhausted to conduct an effective pursuit. As night fell, the scale of the Allied victory became apparent. The Franco-Bavarian army had been utterly shattered. They had suffered over 30,000 casualties, including prisoners. The Allies, in contrast, had lost around 12,000 killed and wounded. The Battle of Blenheim was one of the most decisive victories in modern history. In a single day, the strategic situation in Europe had been transformed. The threat to Vienna was permanently eliminated. Bavaria was knocked out of the war and occupied by the Allies. Most importantly, the myth of French invincibility had been destroyed. Louis XIV's ambitions for continental hegemony had been dealt a mortal blow. Marlborough's fame reached its zenith. He was hailed as the savior of the empire. His partnership with Prince Eugene was celebrated as a model of coalition warfare. The long march to the Danube had been vindicated in the most spectacular fashion. The battlefields of Blenheim fell silent, littered with the terrible cost of victory. Names of the villages, once obscure, were now etched into the annals of history. The triumph was not just one of courage, but of logistics, strategy, and deception. It demonstrated that the armies of the Sun King could be decisively beaten. The War of the Spanish Succession would continue for many more years. But the tide had turned, irrevocably, on that fateful August day. The balance of power in Europe had been reset by force of arms. Marlborough's great gamble had paid off, securing his place as one of history's finest commanders. The echoes of the cannons at Blenheim would reverberate across the continent for a generation. The soldiers of the Grand Alliance had won a victory for the ages. Discipline and bravery had overcome a formidable and confident foe. The French army would take years to recover its strength and its pride. For the men who fought there, the memories of the fire and smoke would never fade. The Battle of Blenheim was a turning point, a day of triumph and of tragedy. It was the day Marlborough secured his triumph in the War of Spanish Succession.